is the purpose of folklore? Do we still need any folklore? Do we still create folklore? Reading about folklore usually ends you up with hundreds of different stories about different beings. So why did people have this need to tell stories about supernatural things? And why do we continue to do that still today? Because we do. Let's see if we can try and sort out at least some of them. One of the biggest problems with trying to categorize things that have sprung from an oral tradition is that you are trying to categorize and structure a thing that don't want to be structured, and categorize things that by nature don't want to be categorized. Because it is basic human behavior we are trying to categorize. So first, I want to explain what I mean with folklore and how it differs from folk tales. Because lore and tales isn't exactly the same thing, even if it is very, very close connected and goes into each other in a way. And both do comes from an oral tradition. And actually, let's start there with the concept of an oral tradition. What is an oral tradition? I am simplifying this very, very much because otherwise we will be here for hours. But in short, an oral tradition means information that travels from mouth to mouth, not written down, and has done so for generations. Within an oral tradition, we find ballads, we find folk tales, we find folklore, hymns, rituals, religion, and in some areas, even laws. Within cultures where the knowledge of reading and writing sometimes isn't as widespread, things aren't written down. But instead we see the knowledge travel through the generation from one person to another by an oral tradition. This means that the knowledge isn't fixed. It changes depending on how that person that is the bearer of that tradition remembers it. But it also changes depending on the audience that the storyteller is speaking to. To take an example, if you travel to Germany and you hear the story of Hans and Gretel, there the kids are being sent into a deep, big forest. You travel home to Iceland and there are no big, deep forests. So that would not make sense for your audience. But it is a good story and you want to tell it to the kids and the adults there. So what do? Well, you change the story. So instead of a forest, it is they get lost on sea and ends up on a very deserted little island. Legends become myth. Myth transforms into fairy tales. Fairy tales transform into folklore. And sometimes they transform back into the fairy tale land again. This is exactly what an oral tradition do. It changes, it adapts, and it picks up things from, well, what you heard. So both folk tales and folklore are very close to connected. They go into each other, and when the story travels, it can turn up more or less as all kinds of genres, depending on the storyteller and the audience. And here we go into what I mean with folklore versus folk tales. As mentioned, folk tales are within the storytelling tradition. It has an anonymous author. It has that oral long tradition back into history, and the stories are often timeless and placeless. Folk tales include subgroups as fairy tales, legends, myth, and tall tales, and also fables. As you hear, folklore and folk tales are very close related to each other, especially in the tall tale category. But as a general rule, folk tales are stories that isn't meant to be believed. It is told as a story. They usually have a moral to teach the audience, but they are placed in a fantasy setting. in the land far, far away, and sometimes the prince and the princess or the other hero in the tale doesn't even have names. The most common subgenre here is fairy tales. We find Snow White, Cinderella, Mother Holle, Vasilisa the Beautiful, etc. And then we have folklore. And we have like thousands of subgroups here too. We have everything that is more or less a complete structured story, as in the fairy tales. And within folklore, we can also include some legends and myth. But the stories are more often told in the form of a retold memory. We have stepped out of the fantasy land here and completely, and these stories are usually meant to be believed in. It can still be entertaining, but instead of the land far, far away, it is told about the village next to your village, or about my cousin's friend that heard that. Since folklore is supposed to be believed, the storyteller usually tries and validate their story by giving the places names, the people in the story names, and also usually ends with a comment or starts with a comment like, "My grandma told me this, and she never lies." Who would want to accuse your grandma of lying? So that is the short difference between folklore and folk tales, and what I'm going to speak about here is mostly folklore. Almost all of the folklore stories have a very clear message, a morale or a warning, and we haven't stopped telling stories. We just have adjusted to the audience. In the older folklore, we meet folklore beings like Näcken, the invisible people, the trolls, and the tomte. In our modern stories, where we might have stopped to believe in Näcken and the trolls, we see sea monsters, the Yeti, aliens, a lot of ghosts. Now, hold on, you must stay. I believe in aliens. Don't come here and tell me that this is just some made up shit. Well, people still believed in the invisibles too, and they still do in some places. And to take one example, our beloved Tomte. People have had a very clear vision on how he looks and how he behaves, and they have had this for 1,000 years. So maybe he actually do exist. Perhaps there are aliens, perhaps there are invisible peoples. Let me tell you, in some places in Iceland, in Sweden and Norway, people will say yes they are. But belief and what I'm speaking about is we have to separate that. Like Ebbe Schön, one of Sweden's most famous researchers, said in his book about tomten, if you actually manage to find a tomte, catch him and put him in a jar in a museum, we would lose a lot of magic around him. And probably we would find another being to put that magic to. People would probably apply his stories to new things. So it doesn't really matter if you believe in aliens or not. The stories around the aliens, around ghosts, around the invisibles, around tomten, these are the things that are fascinating and that kind of exist regardless if he exists or not. You follow me? And I'm not saying this out of thin air, because if you look at stories about aliens that is told today and stories that are very old, sometimes 1,000 years old, you will see a lot of similarities. And the discussion if they are real or not is pretty much irrelevant here, because we are looking at the stories, not at the beings. The beings is not the most interesting, it is what is told about them. That is the folklore. So why do we tell stories? Well, regardless of if it is supposed to be believed or not, we have told stories thousands of years. Humans seem to have had this need to tell stories as far back as it has been words. When it comes to folk tales, examples like Jack the Beanstalk and Beauty and the Beast, they are somewhere between 5,000 to 6,000 years old, depending a little bit on what source you look at. And that's just how far back we can trace them. When you study literature and literature history, it is said that literature starts when humans start to use any kind of written language. This is not the absolute truth, though, because within the oral tradition you find things that is much older than literature, and it's still a sort of literature because it's stories. The oral tradition has also coexisted with the written literature for a lot of years. Like, again, we are talking thousands of years. And we must remember that we still have cultures today where the bigger part of the population can't read or write, so their literature is still told via an oral tradition. Is it literature? It's not written, but is it stories? Yes. And in some of these cultures, as well as some of the historical cultures, the written word might actually be considered less accurate and truthful, which might sound strange to our modern Western ear, but it's a fact. They think that the oral tradition keeps it better than the written tradition because the written tradition is one person's ideas of things. So we should not put ourselves on high horses and say that we here in the West with our written tradition, or China with their written tradition, or Russia with their written tradition always knows best. We don't. But because of the written system, we can trace back some stories to places like Mesopotamia, India, and China, where we do have a very early written language. We can also trace old stories in pictures, stone carvings, etc. And it works the same with both folklore and folk tales in this matter. Even if we have some pictures or words in history, it wasn't until rather recently we tend to actually write down most of the stories. Neither folk tales nor folklore has not properly been recorded and put down in written language until as late as 18th century or later. Until then, both these genres was an oral tradition, and it also helped to spread all the different versions that we have today. We have a great example with the stories about the people that wouldn't stop dancing until just their heads jumped around. There is a tale that you can trace back to the 12th century in a town called Kölbik in Germany, where a bunch of youth gather at the cemetery to hold a dance, and the devil shows up and he starts playing for them. No one can stop dancing until just their heads are jumping around on the ground. From Kölbik it spread all over Europe, and it spread up to Sweden to several places. The story from Horga is perhaps the most famous. In Sweden, the devil's motif is not always kept though. Sometimes this story is told about Näcken, a being that says to be very good at playing music. So the structure of the story is kept, the morale of the story is kept. Do not hold dances at the cemetery, beware. But the town shifts, the people shifts, and sometimes also the being shifts. And that is how an oral tradition works. You hear a good story, you take it home, and you change things to make it more suitable for your audience. And in some examples, more believable. And when someone says, hey, I heard that story told in Germany, the Swede will say, yeah, but they stole it from us. My grandma told me this, and she does not lie. I know this happened here in my town. So very, very simplified, folklore is told for a couple of reasons. Entertainment, We want to be entertained. You can clearly see that some folklore is told to entertain because they have borrowed so much from the folk tales that they are more or less copying the story. They just put the location to a place near home and give the people in the story names. To warn about things. Do not go near the water, you might drown. The creature living there might eat you. Or don't be out late because the trolls is going to get you. Don't scream in the mine because the mistress of the mines or the trolls will make the mine cave in. Then we have 3 to explain our surroundings and to explain why we do things a certain way. Why is that stone looking so strange? What are those strange circles in the grass where nothing will grow or where the grass has changed color? We also keep telling stories to keep traditions and uphold norms. This is perhaps the most important role our folktale have, to uphold norms, to keep the traditions. We see this in almost all the different stories about the folklore beings. They tell you how bad things can go if you do not keep your place in society and if you are not behaving according to that society's unspoken rules. We also tell stories to connect to each other. Folklore creates a common ground, something we use to build connections and a feeling of we, and sadly also them. I will go further into all of these categories later, but here in this 5th reason, we have a little bit of a dark side to the folklore, something we very clearly still see in our modern folklore stories. And last but not least, we tell stories to scare ourselves a bit, but just the right amount. So there is a number 1, entertainment. It is all sort of self-explainable. I don't think I need to go into this too deep. We humans get bored. Just like cats and dogs that isn't stimulated, we like to entertain ourselves. And since we have a language, we entertain each other with music, with art, and with stories. The next reasons is a bit more entangled, and I will try and keep them as separate as possible. But again, here is where we see that when we try to structure and categorize this, it is a bit hard because it gets entangled into each other. But let's start with the first one, to explain things. We have a need to communicate and also to explain our surroundings and behavior. The stories gives us a context of our lives and a meaning and a security. In a way, you can say it calms our minds. To get that explanation, you don't have to think about it, so you can kind of put it aside. There will always be those individuals, of course, doesn't just explain one explanation, and they will push on and explore and twist and turn to see if this really is what is said it is. Early in history, we might have called them philosophers, thinkers, even crazy and mad, and today we usually call them scientists. But as a general rule, for most people, if you get an explanation of a thing and you find that explanation believable, then you can rest your mind and put that aside. You don't have to worry about it because the story also gives you an answer to how to handle it. If you look to our story and the common people, we can see that the official religion could sometimes be perceived as something that was a bit harder to understand, and folklore was easier. And we still uses this to calm our mind when we create a story and truth around something that we don't know much about. Today we like to think that we know everything, but actually we still have a lot of places in the world where we need to explain things. Things out there are still a bit scary and we don't understand or know anything about it. So to answer the question, do we still need folklore and do we still use and create folklore? Hell yes. Yes, we do. There are numerous examples of stories that function just like the stories about elves and trolls did 150 years ago. We just changed the settings to aliens or ghosts. The sea monster is still there under the surface in the depth of the oceans, but suddenly it's not a magic creature, it's an ancient dinosaur that has lived on without us knowing it. We are also creating new creatures. Slender Man is perhaps one of the most famous and modern example, but there are others. There are the Mothman, we have lizard people, well, the list goes on. And here we go back to the story's way of spreading. We haven't stopped telling stories, but today we don't expect our audience to believe in trolls, so we tell a story about aliens or the evil other people that lived far away. Back 150 years ago, the forest was a big and scary place. We didn't know anything about it. It just came with a lot of dangers. Bad things could happen there. People can disappear. And today, space have that same blank space, and the sea is also one of those blank space. So that's where we fill these places with stories about what is actually out there. We need to explain it. We need to warn about it so that we can create explanations and calm our minds. This is what folklore does. It fills the holes where we don't have an explanation. Earlier in history, when people didn't have as much education as what we do today, when they saw things in nature, they came up with explanation based on their level of knowledge. If you never heard about the Ice Age and how that huge ice moved rocks and then melted and kind of left the rocks there, pictures like this was of course very strange, and it needed its explanation. Trolls and giants, that must be it. Because for them, trolls was as real as aliens are for some people today. Did they have proof? Well, yeah, I mean, look at it. How else would you explain that stone has been put above the other stone? If not a giant creature did it, how? Today there are stories about aliens that moved stones or create phenomena in nature that we still haven't found a reasonable explanation for. Throughout Scandinavian history, folklore has been used as an explanation of mental illness and children with development issues. Changelings. We see nightmares being explained by a creature, maran in Swedish folklore, that sits on your chest and while you're sleeping is trying to suffocate you. Today we call it sleep paralysis. But we still blame a lot of our strange encounters on ghosts or demons. A quick look at Reddit and we found thousands of stories that are almost the same as the one told in Sweden 200 years ago. The description of the feeling and sometimes even the looks of the beings are more or less the same, but we change and adapt the stories to what is closest and most reasonable for us. Just take YouTube. There are a lot of different channels that read the stories from Reddit and from internet. And I have a favorite, and that's Mr. Nightmare. And if you go and listen to his stories, which is excellent done and excellent read. I love that channel because, yeah, some of them are real or could be real, and they are really scary. And sometimes what I hear, for me, they are clearly a piece of fantasy, but they are still fascinating and a bit scary. Those stories also serve what we come to the next reason, to give warnings about things. There are many dangerous things that can happen to people, both in nature, on an old farm, or in an urban environment. The chaotic beings like trolls and elves and the invisibles was of course not something you wanted around, so they were used as cautionary tales to people to tell them what to look out for. and also how to handle it. Here in history you find a lot of stories about the trolls and elves. Trolls can steal your stuff if you don't keep a lock on your doors. The tomte might take all your luck away from your farm and let you starve if you did not keep your stable in order and take care of the animals and the equipment. Necken might drown you if you went down alone to the water. In modern days, you instead find warnings of alien abductions, ghosts, demons that infest houses. Lock your doors and windows, otherwise an insane person might enter your home and try to kill you. That last one is actually a real threat. I mean, crazy people do exist, criminals do exist. But that doesn't mean the story is always real. Real or not, again, it's not important. But that we keep telling all these stories and that they keep spreading. We also have the modern stories about what happened to people that wander into shady bars and ends up in Thailand with just one kidney. Back in the older days, we see almost the exact same stories told about Freemasons or other kind of different guilds, and of course also the nobility. And when I say almost exact, I mean almost exact. These stories about people ending up in Thailand with just one kidney, where people have stolen their organs, they have even been written down in actually some newspapers that normally are very good newspapers and very trusted newspapers. But when you read the story, you see that the person is never really having a name. The place is somewhat hazy. It could be New York or somewhere in Thailand. And if you start to look into the stories and start to see, have there ever been a police matter of this? No, you will not find anything of this, because it probably never happened. Again, the realness of the story is not important. It is how the stories spreads and how they are used. The warnings also blends with what happens if you break the norms and traditions. This way to warn you about things, but also to teach morals and rules and how to behave. Do not walk into shady bars, bad things can happen. Do not go down to the water by yourself, you might drown. The warnings also blends with what happens when you break norms and traditions. And this, like I said, might have been and still are one of our most important reasons to why folklore have been told and still are told. We use stories to keep all these sometimes unwritten rules that we have in our society and warn you about what happens if you break them, and thus we uphold traditions and norms, a code of how to behave. To give a really good and clear example of this, I can mention the creature myling. I did a whole video about that, and you find a link up here and in the description below. Myling is a ghost child that has been murdered by its mother and buried somewhere in secret. The myling will then haunt the place of its burial, and sometimes in the story it kills the mother by sucking her tits until she bleeds to death. And in some other stories, the myling exposes the mother's crime and she is executed for it. This being is clearly created to keep women in check, to tell them that you should not have a child out of wedlock and you should not try and do abortions, etc. With stories like this about women that kills her child to cover her shame and then severely get punished and killed for it, we uphold the norm of how important it is to cross your legs, not risk having a child out of wedlock, and if you do, you need to tell people about your shame. You need to confess to the crime. As I mentioned in a lot of my other videos, it is very often that the folklore is created to uphold patriarchy's rules. Women are warned to break those rules. They usually end up dead or insane if they do. In the stories, there are many stories that tells how women is unprotected when they have just given birth, when they are pregnant, or when they are on their period. Both women and the newborn child is something that seems to lure out a variety of folklore beings. The child needs protection in its bed, and the woman needs to wear her husband's shirt and to wear steel and other items that might be considered magically loaded to scare these beings off. And she needs to stay on the farm and not go out by herself, and she needs to be taken back into society as soon as possible. This is something that can be found in a lot of folklore around the world, not just within the Christian religion, but actually other religions. A woman that had just given birth is considered an individual that needs a bit of extra protection. And further back we go into history, the more protection she needed. And that's not so strange. I mean, a woman that just have given birth is vulnerable. And if we go back in history, she might actually have been needed protection against predators and so on. Bleeding during your period is also something that isn't strange that you were warned about. Perhaps earlier in history, the warning about necking during your period was a good way of not getting an infection, because you were bathing in ponds and other places with questionable clean water. Nothing strange with this. But the stories also tells us that according to a lot of different cultures around the world, the woman is unpure after she has given birth or when she is on her period. The birth process is something strange and magical. It is not surprising that it has been loaded with all kinds of magic. In our modern days, at least in the Western world, the birth process is somewhat less magic. We usually know enough to not think of it as real magic. But still, it is magic. It's magical. Just look how many stories and movies that use that trope about a woman giving birth at the least suitable time and place. Just like in the movie world, the norms and the truth are of course not always the real fact and truth, but if we heard it all our lives, it becomes a truth for us. And we do not question it because it seems logical to us. Here, in upholding the traditions and unwritten rules, norms, and creation of our truth, it's also where the stories have a darker side. And this is actually rather important, very important, perhaps the most important thing I have to say in this whole video. These stories, both historic and modern, very often serves the purpose of we versus them. Not only does both the old and the new folklore serves as an upholder of norms and truth and traditions, but it also clearly point out what is not the norm and the people not included in this norm, and they are usually dangerous. By this, they work as a bearer of different racist and misogynistic ideas. We already covered a lot around the women, but if you look at the past of the folklore, there are groups that are clearly described as dangerous, and this happened in a lot of different cultures. In the stories up here in north, you can see that it's always a Finn or a Sami or a Jew or a dark-skinned person that is evil, and that is the person that you need to watch out for. Read enough of these stories and the storyteller doesn't even need to tell you that it is a Finn or a Sami. You will just know from the start that the person is talking about one of these categorized people. And sadly, we have not stopped doing this. Far from. When you hear stories that are about my cousin's friend or in a town in Alberta, start to think, why is this told? Is it to warn us about those dangerous others? The black people, the Asian people, the gay people, the criminals? If you find a clear message in that story, a clear morale in that story, and you get that gut feeling that this is going to be the Asian people, isn't it? And then the storyteller tells that, yes, it was the Asian people. You can bet your sweet behind on that. That story is not a truth. It is a truth. It is created to uphold a certain belief system, a certain tradition, a certain norm. These stories are most likely folkloristic when you hear them. The structure is the same, they just change whatever it is you're supposed to look out for. Now, I mentioned Mr. Nightmare stories before, and how they are very often about insane people that try to enter your home, and therefore you need to lock your doors and windows. I'm not saying leave your door open and let everybody in. Criminals and insane people can be dangerous. But the amount of stories around this, I don't think that all of them are truth. And when it suddenly always is a black person that tries to enter your home, well, that's when I say this is upholding a norm. So that's when it's your responsibility to not retell this story and spread the norm further. But to end this on a little more happy note, when it comes to all these things, when we know how a thing works, we can change it, right? So now, when you hear a tall tale and you get that uneasy gut feeling and the thought, oh, it's going to be the Asian people, then you know that this is probably folkloristic and you can understand the story in another way. You might even be able to confront the person telling the story and ask, why did they feel the need to spread this further? So, as you see, the different reasons for folklore and its purpose and spreading is a bit entangled. Entertainment, to warn about things, to explain things in an easy way, to keep up traditions and norms, to get that sense of us, and to connect with each other. And then we have the last reason, which is actually the most fun reason, to give ourselves a little bit of thrill. That's why I like to go to Mr. Nightmare and listen to his stories. Our brains like when things are simple, but it also likes a little kick now and then. Some like kicks more than others, and that's probably why some people like to watch horror movies and thrillers. And this might seem strange and odd, but actually our brains are wired this way. We like to scare ourselves while we are in a safe place, because that way we are training our brains how to react to real dangers when they actually appear. Back in the old days, there was no TV, so instead we told stories. Because that's what our movies and TV series are now, stories. It's just another format of it. And we still tell ghost stories, and we still tell stories about dangerous places and incidents, and we like to scare ourselves a little bit with that. Because we are training our brains how to handle our emotions. We need stories. We need them to explain our surroundings. We need them to calm our minds and to explain our feelings, and we need to put things in words. But as already mentioned, this tends to connect people but also divides us. And when you have figured out the system, you can break it. Thank you again for listening. Please feel free to spread this, share, like, comment. It helps the channel a lot. I have just reached 500 subscribers plus. I think I'm on a little bit plus now. And I'm very, very happy for that. And I do hope that you like my content. So until next time, be safe, listen to stories and enjoy them. Just be a little bit careful to what you believe in.